Hi all, welcome to Cyber Warfare Labs AWS Cloud Red Team course. In this module, we will discuss about how we can use command line utility to enumerate different informations about AWS Lambda functions as well as AWS API gateways. So let's get started. So first, we are going to enumerate about Lambda functions. One thing you should keep in mind that when you are going to enumerate information about particular services such like Lambda functions, your user should have a sufficient rights to enumerate the information. Suppose I'm using a command line utility AWS CLI. In this case, the user whom access key and secret we configured in our CLI have a sufficient rights. That means at least list and get permissions there in the particular AWS resources. So if you have a list and get permissions, then only you can enumerate informations. So suppose the user which I compromised during my red team operation have a sufficient privilege to enumerate the information. I already configured the secret key as well as the value here in AWS CLI. Now let's get started. So first we are going to enumerate about how many Lambda functions are there in this particular AWS account. One thing, this is really important, that Lambda functions are region basis. That means a particular region, if you create a Lambda functions, there may be chance that this Lambda function is not available in other region. So when you are going to enumerate, you have to specify the region name explicitly. If you didn't specify the region name, it will take the default region, which is when you set your AWS CLI. When you are going to configure the CLI, you have to specify the region. And suppose in this case, first we are going to enumerate about all the functions there in this particular region. It will not give the information about all function in AWS account. It will give the information about all the function there in this particular region. So let's see. So see, you can see here I didn't specify the region name here, so it will take the region from my configuration of CLI. But suppose if you specify the region, let's see, let's clear this one and specify the region US East 1. Let's see how many Lambda functions are there in this region. You can see there is no Lambda function are available in this region. What about region 2? US East 2? Yes. So basically, how and why it's helpful, because when you create an automated tool to enumerate all the Lambda function in particular AWS account, you have to brute force regarding all the region there in this AWS account. So this is a really important to understand about what services is basically region based, what are services is not the region based. So this is the services which is a regional based. That means if you have Lambda function in particular region, you have to specify the region name explicitly. So suppose I specify here the region name US East 2. So in this particular region, this is the Lambda function 1. That name is red team fun. So these are the information which is related to these functions. The function name. Second thing is ARN of these functions, which is uniquely identified. Runtime. This is really important. So what underline you can say programming language it used to compile or to execute this particular code. So they are using here, we are using Python 3.7. It's basically used to execute the code which we have in this Lambda function. And this is the role, which is also an important entity here. Role basically what permission this Lambda function have in other AWS services. Basically by default there is a CloudWatch logs. That means this Lambda function can push the logs to the CloudWatch. There may be a possibility that this Lambda function have access to any other services, just like there is a code, there is applications in Lambda function which is trying to access the files which is stored there in S3 bucket. So in that case, the Lambda function should have the role, and role have a permissions to access the S3 buckets. So this is really important about what policy is attached to this particular role and what are the permission there in these policies. And this is you can identify by a role which is attached to this Lambda function. Then size and other informations. There is one more information that's called layers. Layers basically in Lambda function you have a functions where you specify your source code, what you want to execute, but there may be a chance that you directly using a third-party library or dependencies. All this thing will come here in the layer. So you can upload as many as dependencies there, and you can link these dependencies to this particular Lambda functions. So these functions we have two things. One is code, which is basically the pure code for this Lambda function, and second thing we have this third-party library or dependencies. The ARN of these dependencies will be here. So this is the information we'll get. Now what other I need two things. One is what is the source code of this Lambda function, and second thing, if dependency is there, what is the source code of this particular dependency. So there are two more things which we are going to enumerate. So all other information you can see here. You can see the similar thing for Lambda function 2. The name is red team font 2, and similar like we have other information about red team font. So this is all about how many Lambda functions are there in this particular region of AWS account. So you can see there is only 3 functions there in this particular region. Now what next? What is our next goal? What we are going to enumerate? Next, we are going to enumerate about the source code of this particular functions. We know that this is a function name, this is a role is attached, what is the runtime environment they use, then what is the source code of this particular functions. So this is a command which will give you the source code information and other few more other informations. So let's copy this command here. Open a new tab, paste it here, specify the function name. So suppose using here red team fun1, let's paste it here and let's see. The same information ARN, role, runtime, the same information we got here, you can see you will get here also, but there is one more thing. This is a code section. This is a repository type. It is stored in S3, and this is a time-based URL. You can download the code from S3 using this time-based URL, which is valid for a certain period of time. So just copy this one, open a browser, paste it here, and that's all. I'm able to download the particular function source code here. So let's open this one. Let's extract here, and this is the file which is there in Lambda function, and you can also see the source code. So this is the source code. This is the code which is there in this Lambda function. So this is how you can download the source code of particular Lambda function. But to download this thing, you need a get permissions. You need this get permission there in Lambda function. If you have a get permission, it will give you the time-based URL, and you can use this URL to download the functions. So this URL, when you're going to access this URL, it's basically already authenticated URL or time-based URL. You no need to have the rights or permissions. It's basically you can just copy it and you can download it. It will be expired after a certain period of time. So this is how we can download the code. Now we have information about Lambda function. We have information about the code. Now what next do we need? We need who can invoke this function, or how we can execute these functions. As we already discussed in our introduction phase, there's multiple ways, basically 3 ways to invoke this function: synchronous, asynchronous, and string basis. Then how we can get the information about who have a rights to invoke the Lambda functions. So this is the command, or these are the information. I'll get it from policies, get policy information. So it will retrieve the policy information about specified Lambda functions. In policy, you can see there who have a rights to invoke these functions. So just copy this function from here, paste it here, and specify the function name. So I'm going to specify the function name is rating fun1. And that's all. You can see here, this is the policy which is attached to this function. That means who have a rights to access this function. So it's basically a resource-based policy. That's why you have a principal in this section. So you can see here, effect allow. This means this policy allow principal whom allow API gateway. So it will allow all the API gateway. What action they can do? They can invoke the Lambda functions. What resource? So they can only invoke this function red team R1. So they can only invoke these functions. But here you can see it's basically allow all the services, but we have a condition specific here. That means only this API can invoke this function. So this is the API, the ARN of this API. You can see AWS source ARN. This is the ARN of this API. This is the API ID. Here we can specify the methods. That means allow for all method, all the stages, and this is the, we can see, endpoint as well as resources. So this is how you can understand about who can invoke these functions. Let's see, because now we found that only API gateway can invoke these functions. But when we discuss about how we can invoke, there is multiple ways: synchronous, asynchronous, stream basis. So this is the synchronous. That means API gateway can invoke this function. But there may be a chance that other AWS services can invoke this function like SNS, SQS, S3 as well. So let's see when we're going to enumerate policy about another functions. Let me fun2 yes. So this is the first one, is the same API gateway. Second one, you can see here there is this principal. That means allow principal S3 Amazon AWS.com. That means AS3 also can invoke this function. What action they can do? They can invoke these functions, and this is the resource. That means this can invoke this red team function too. The condition is only this particular S3 bucket can invoke these functions. So this is how you can identify that who can invoke these particular functions. So get policy command will give the information about the permissions, who have a permissions to invoke this function. But it will only give the information about synchronous as well as asynchronous invocations. When we discuss about Lambda invocation or triggering, you can see there is multiple ways, 3 ways. One is synchronous, that means we can use API gateway. Second one is asynchronous, we can use SNS or S3. Third one is stream basis, where we have a DynamoDB and Kinesis, if we getting the request of multiple times, in a stream format. When you want to enumerate information about synchronous and asynchronous, you need these functions or this command, get policy. So get policy will give you the information about who have rights or who can invoke this function using asynchronous or synchronous. But when you are looking for the stream basis, who can invoke this function using stream methods, there is a way. This is the command, list event source mapping. So it's basically event source mapping. It will retrieve the event source mapping information about the specified Lambda function. So let's see, is there any function which can be invoked by stream basis? So just copy this one, and here you have to specify the function name. So suppose I'm specifying the red team fun1. You can see there is no event source mapping is related to this one. What about Lambda function 2? Yeah, there is no event source mapping. So this is how you can understand about who can access and what method they can use to invoke these functions. Okay, so now what next? Next will be the layers. So we discuss about the functions, how can retrieve the code, how can retrieve that, who can invoke this function by a different method. Now what about layers? We know there is a layer, but what code does layer is contain? Because we already got the information about the source code how we can get the source code of this particular function. But what about the layers? So this command will give the information about all layer that is there in AWS account. So let's copy this one. Paste it here. So you can see there is only one layer present in AWS Lambda functions. And this is the name of this layer, request library. So basically layer is a third-party library or any dependency which is there. But when you want to enumerate about a source code of this particular layer, why it's really important? Because there may be chance that source code is fully patched and there is no vulnerabilities there in the source code, but there may be chance that layers or dependency or library are outdated. There may be already existing few vulnerabilities like RC or any other vulnerabilities. So for source code analysis purpose, you have to enumerate what is the source code of this particular library. So let's copy this command. So this will download and this will give you the time-based URL for this particular layer source code. So I'm just opening a new tab. You have to specify the version number. So there may be a layer or there may be a library which have a multiple versions. So you can see this have a only single version, and this is the name of this library. So you have to specify version 1, and you have to specify library. That's all. You can see here this will also give the information about same like the layer information, ARN of this information, and this is the code which is time-based URL. It will be valid for a certain period of time. You can copy it. You can again download the source code of this particular layer or dependency. You can see here there is a request library, the Python library. I again extract it, and you can see this is the folder which is there, and these are the other packages or libraries there in this particular layer. So this is how you can get the informations about layers and what source code does this layers or dependency contain. So this is all about the information you can get it from the Lambda functions. There is a multiple thing you can do it, but we will discuss in our attacking phase when we are going to actually initial access, when we are going to perform a privilege escalations. Then we are going to enumerate, or we are going to use a different commands or methods to do all this activity. But in enumeration phase, these are the things we should keep in mind, or we should know, or we should aware doing any red team operations. So once we have aware that who can invoke this function, what are the source code that it contains, we can perform our further task. We can design the attack roadmap, and we can perform the further red teaming activities. So this is the enumeration phase. We'll get the information about Lambda function. Now second thing that we are going to enumerate is API gateway, which is separate services, but we club together in a single module. Why? Because API gateway is also important, and it's helpful to you to trigger the Lambda functions. Because you have an API in Lambda function, you can use API gateway to trigger the Lambda function. But apart from triggering the Lambda function, API gateway is also used to consume your API, which is running in EC2 instance, or which is running in your on-prem environment. So how we can get the more information about API gateway? What information I can enumerate? What is really important for red teamers to enumerate information before starting red team life cycle? So let's close this one. Let's open a new tab, and these are the commands which we use to enumerate information about API gateway. So first we are going to enumerate about how many APIs there in this our AWS account. This is also a region based, so you have to specify the region, otherwise it will take the default region. In AWS account, in API gateway, we have a three type of APIs. One is REST API, second one is HTTP API, and third one is WebSocket API. And out of three, REST API is more it's more powerful, so you can customize the request and response, and you have a more rights to do all this activity in REST APIs. So for our purpose, we are only enumerating REST API, but you can also enumerate the WebSocket API and HTTP API, which is also useful for your red team operations. So first, we are going to enumerate all the REST API there in this particular account in this particular region. Just copy this one. So region thing, talking multiple times because it's really important. Because you found that there is an API which is there in region 1, but there is no API which is any other region. So you have to enumerate all the region, you have to specify all the region. So let's copy this one, paste it here, and you can see it will give the information about the APIs, REST API especially in this particular region. So you can see there is a 3 API. This is the first API. This is the ID of this particular REST API. This is the name of the API. This is the date we created, API source, and other informations. So this will help us to understand about how many API in this particular region they have. Now what next? So you can also get the information about a specific API. So this command will give you all the API, all the REST API in this particular region. But you can also specify the region name as well as this REST API ID. Let's copy this one. So this will give the information about the specific API. Specific API, that means you can specify the API ID. Suppose you did the enumeration on Lambda function and you found that this is the API which is invoke this function, so you can get the information about this particular API only, because there is only 3 API, but in a organization there is a 10,000 of API will be there. So when you want to get the information about a specific API, you have to use this command and you have to specify the API ID. Let's copy this API ID and let's paste it here. So this will give the information about this is the API, this is the API name, and this is the API key source and all other information. Now what next? If you have information about this, okay, this is the API ID, this is the name of this API, what you are going to enumerate. So when we discuss about API, let's see how we can craft a URL, because API means you have to craft a URL, and this is the way you can craft a URL. These are the things you need to craft a URL. What thing you need? You need a method, either it's a get, post, put, whatever methods this API gateway support, API ID, region, stage, resource, and parameters. So we have information of API ID, we have information about region. The 3 things we are going to enumerate is method, stage, and resource. Parameter you can enumerate looking for the source code. So how they accepting the parameter, or you can also check for the mapping between your API gateway as well as your Lambda function. So now we are going to enumerate about method, stage, and resource. Resource basically endpoint. So let's enumerate one by one. So first we are going to enumerate about resource. So resource basically endpoint. So how many resources are there in this particular API? This is the command which will give the list of information about a collection of resources in this particular API. Let's copy this one. Open a new tab, paste it here, and you have to specify the API ID. So it will give the resource information about this particular API only. This is the API which I'm going to enumerate. And that's all. You can see here there is a 2 resource. One is a default or root resource, and second one is the system resource. So this is how you can understand about how many endpoints or resource are there in this particular API. So you understood there is a 2 resource. One is root resource and second one is system resource. Now what next? We know we have informations about API ID, region, resource. Now what we are going to enumerate is methods as well as stage. So let's check how we can get the more information. Okay, so here what I got the resource. So you got the list of resource. You can also enumerate a resource using specify the resource ID or the particular resource. Let's copy this command. The first command, this command will list it down all the resource which is related to this API, and this command will give the specific resource informations. So you can see there is a resource ID is also mentioned there. When you want to get the information about this particular resource, you can use this command. So what I'm going to enumerate, I have to specify the resource ID. I'm using the system resource here, so I use this ID. This is the resource ID and this is the API ID. That's all. So the same information you will get, but you will get the information related to or specified by a resource ID. So if you have multiple resources, you can get the information about this resource ID as well as API ID. Now what next we are going to enumerate? We are going to enumerate about methods. So method basically generally HTTP method which is used to invoke the APIs. Now, there may be get method, put method, delete method, options, or any different methods. So we have to check what method this particular resource or API is, accepted. So basically, method is only applicable on the resource base endpoint. What method this endpoint supported? So let's copy this command and paste it here. Now what information we have? So we are using get method command. You have to specify the API ID. Okay, we have API ID. So this is the API we have. This is the API ID we have. Perfect. Now you have to specify the resource ID. Why? Because method is only applicable on the resource basis. So suppose this is the endpoint. What are the methods this endpoint support? Basically, does it allow you to get the information? Does it allow you to update any information? It's basically depend on the resource or endpoint which is there. This is the ID of this particular resource, and here you have to specify the method. So suppose I specify post method. Does this endpoint support? No. So you can see invalid method identified. It means this resource or endpoint doesn't support post method. Let's see, does it support get method? You can see here this is also important. This is a resource method. You can see there is only one method, and that's all. You are able to see how we can use this method and why. It's really important because it will not only give the information about method supported, but also give the information about, do you need to have this authorization token or do you need an API key? Does it support the authorization or do you need an API key? You can see its authorization type is none. API key required is false. That means to use this API or this endpoint, you need a GET request without API key. So if you use it, you can invoke the method. So this is the response, and this is the really important integrations. What is happening in the background? So suppose you can invoke this API, but what will be happen? You don't know how they integrated with other services. You can see here, this is integrated with AWS proxy, and this is the URL which is going to execute. That means it's going to execute this Lambda functions, which is there in USA East 2. This is the path of the functions, and you can see this will execute this red team function and invocation rights this have. So this is how you can identify that what is happening or what this particular endpoint will do. This particular resource accept a GET request without API key, without authorization, and can invoke this Lambda functions. So this is how you can enumerate a lot more information, as who can invoke what functions, what permissions they have. So you can check it bi-directional. You can even look at for the Lambda function to see who can invoke it, and you can also check in the resource ID and what resource basically invoking this particular Lambda functions. Now what next? So we checked about all this information. We have idea about methods, we have idea about API ID, region, resource, and stage. Now we are going to enumerate information about stage. Stage basically means, suppose you have a multiple versions. So this API we have a version 1, version 2, version 3, or you can also have this basically it's a production, this API for production, this API for staging, this API for development purpose. You can segregate this thing, and this is how stage is defined. So how we can enumerate the information about a stage? This is the command which will give all the stage there in this particular API. So you have to specify the API ID only. So here you have to specify the REST API ID. So this is the API ID. Let's see how many stages are there. There may be a multiple stage, but there may be single stage. By default, there will be default stage, but you can see I have this prod stage. It's accepting the GET request and all other information. I only need this. This is the stage and this is the deployment ID. So now we have everything. You can also use to enumerate about a specific stage name. So this is basically, this command will list it down all the stage, but if you want to enumerate a specific stage, you have to specify the application ID as well as the stage ID. Let's copy this command. This will also give the similar information, but if you have a multiple stage, you have to specify the stage name. So here I have to specify this application ID. This is the application ID, and this particular application ID, I want to get the information about this specified stage name. So you can see there is only one stage. You can specify the stage name here, and that's all. It will give the similar information, but only the specified stage name. So this is how you can enumerate the information. So we already, by enumerating all these methods, you can create or you can craft this URL, which is used to invoke the Lambda function or which is used to consume the APIs. Now there is one thing which is left is parameter. So you can see the source code and you can look at the parameters accepting by this particular code. So this is the information you can get it from there. So what next do we need? And that is really important about API key, because in this case, this particular application case, when we are going to enumerate about the resource, you can see there is no API key required false, but there may be chance that few and lot more services, because organization doesn't open these APIs to all the world, so they restrict using the API key. So suppose if you have an API key, then only you can consume or access this API, and then only you can invoke the Lambda functions. So we are going to enumerate all the API key which is there. So this is the command which will give the information about all the API key which API key there in this particular account. Paste it here, and this flag include value flag will use to include the value of the API key. So this is the ID of this API, this is the value of this API, this is the name of this API. So there may be multiple APIs, 10,000 API key will be there in this particular account. So this is how you can get the information. You can also get the information about the single API. So you have to specify the API key here. This is similar to this one, but if you have more 10,000 API and you found that this is the only API which is used to this one, you can use this operations. You have to specify this. What you have to specify API key. Let's copy this one. Do we need a key ID or what? Yes, it will also give the similar result. But now we understood that what are the information we need actually from the API gateway to craft a URL and to does it accept the authentication, does it have authentication, or we need any API key. If we need, we have to enumerate all the informations and we have to craft the URL. This URL will use to invoke the API gateway it will basically hit the API gateway and invoke our Lambda functions. So this is how you can understand about how this all the enumeration phases will really important in other red team operations. So this is all about this video. Thank you so much for watching this video.